Okay, our last speaker is Dan Kaiser, and he'll give us a Minnesota perspective. I remember when Dan was hired, and I actually was representing the Department of Ag on the search committee, and Dan, along with the other people that were interviewing, all had the exact same question, and we're wondering about, does Minnesota have a checkoff program? Mike talked a little bit about the economic value. There's also great value in bringing high quality researchers to the state of Minnesota like Dan. So appreciate you being here today, Dan. Dan has been a major recipient of AFREC. In fact, I calculated out you've managed over $3 million worth of research since you started with the department.
Figured out why I'm so tired too after all that projects. So
well, thank you.
So I'm going to give the perspective kind of in the middle of the two. And I mean, literally and figuratively, I've kind of been in the middle of the two in terms of Antonio and Dave's work, getting a lot of questions from consultants across the state in terms of what we're going to do in Minnesota with our potassium guidelines. Just a little background. I started with Antonio back in 2001, and some of the first work I did in August of 2001, just right before I started my master's, was working with some of this retained or this non-exchangeable K, that tetraphenyl boron extraction. And we're doing some more of that now. I'm not going to get into it. Dave covered a lot too of some things that I was going to cover. So I'm going to skip through some of this just to kind of focus on where we're going with the Minnesota guidelines. So back in 2020, I did have some revisions on the guidelines at that point in time. We did change some of the potassium guidelines, and some of this was following some of the stuff that Antonio was showing, mainly with the issues with the potassium. When we started looking at our data, particularly if you looked at kind of some of that ugliness of that cloud of points that Antonio had, particularly when we started looking at the southern part of the state. So we did increase our guidelines to look at the where we maxed out, where we recommended K up to 200 part per million. So it kind of matched with what the Iowa guidelines were, even though we had some instances, and I'll show some of the data where we're actually seeing a much lower response. And, you know, I talked to Antonio back about 9 months ago or so, and one of the questions he had really is with some of this, the guidelines is, why would we look at our critical soil test levels changing based on mineralogy? And, you know, looking at some of the data I have, I mean, looking at Minnesota, we have a much greater mix of soil types. And I think and I'll show some of that data in terms of how our soils retain it, I think does bear out some potential differences that we need to be looking at with our potassium guidelines. So this is where we're at now. If you look at it, our high classifications for corn and soybeans were increased to that 150 to 200 range, which had been 120 to 160. Looking at a lot of the data, though, you know, I think a lot of it maybe, if we look at 160, could have been the fact where some of our potassium research was focused in the past. And if you looked at the state itself, if you look at from the east to the west, we see a significant difference in our native concentrations of potassium in the soil. So I think with what I'm looking at now, some of the things start to make sense, kind of with where our historical guidelines were. But it wasn't necessarily fitting, particularly some of the issues. And really where I wanted to focus on was the central part of the state in the Des Moines lobe, where we'd been seeing some issues in terms of underrepresenting what the overrepresenting what the available K was in some of those soils. So we have been doing a number of small plot trials. I only wish they would look as clean as this. This was some data that my student Leanna Negan, who I borrowed some slides from one of her talks here. We're looking at some rate data, and that's one of the things that I'm not going to talk or focus much on, is we are looking at calibrations right now. The data, though, hasn't been as clean, and that's the thing that frustrates me more often than not. I look at the phosphorus data we have, and I think the answer is much more clear in terms of what we're seeing, in terms of the predictability of the soil test and our recommendations. Potassium, a lot of times you get a response to the first rate you apply, and you don't necessarily see anything beyond that, or you get a very little response at all. So it's been trying to figure out what's going on. So we're in the process of that. So with the guidelines, with the calibrations, and also one of the other questions I had in 2020 is we did change and look at some removal-based recommendations for corn and soybean production. I will likely be putting that in the next update, just giving you kind of what I would consider to be my target critical values. And that's some of the stuff here I'm gonna talk about today. So I think Dave covered a lot of this. If you look at potassium in the soil, again, in terms of conceptually, it doesn't seem to be as complex. Dave showed a very complex graph in terms of that's more complex than this. And if you look at phosphorus, the reactions are much more complex than potassium. So if you look at potassium, the answer should be simple, although we look at a lot of our data, it's been highly frustrating. And when I start looking at recommendations to growers, that's one of the things that does concern me a little bit, is that we tend to prioritize potassium slightly lower than phosphorus in some circumstances, even though I think the phosphorus soil test is much more solid to help us make recommendations. So that's been one of the things that I've been really trying to focus on, is if you've got a phosphorus soil test above a certain point, I think it's easier to cut at that point versus potassium, particularly if you're in some of these soils that it's kind of questionable in terms of how accurate the soil test it is itself. So this is the thing I like about Minnesota, is that we're interesting when it comes to some of the potassium availability issues in some of our parent materials. So if you, again, you go from east to west, typically we see that the native levels of potassium have increased, although we do tend to see more and more in the western part of the state. Soil tests start to drop to points where we needed potassium. Although we get into the Red River Valley in some of those soils, it's not uncommon to find potassium soil tests 300 to 400 part per million. So, there's a lot of differences out there, and then the parent material, I think, does have a lot of effect on the K retention. And that's one of the focuses that Leanna, with her project, we were looking at, is trying to look at K retention, because I think that factors in considerably when we start talking about critical levels and why there should be some differences out there, because we know there's soils out there that just can't retain the same level of potassium, particularly some of our outwash, those blue areas, where we can't necessarily build to that 200 point because the low cation exchange capacity just makes it relatively difficult to get much more than even about half of that in some of these soils. So some of the factors we're looking at in terms of availability right now, mineralogy, and I'll show some of that data because we have done some of the same mapping that Dave did. And I'll kind of give you an idea. We're not completely done with that work. There were 20 to 30 more samples that the maps I'm going to show you are, while they're complete based on what we had, we still have some changes to make. Besides some questions, particularly up in the Red River Valley, when you start looking at some of those beach ridges, that those sands, I think, behave somewhat different than we see in other parts of the state. So we were trying to get more data. We just haven't been able to work that into that database. CEC is thrown out there. The thing about CEC, though, if you look at it, it works pretty closely with clay mineralogy. So if you look at the two together, you look at some of the tri-state recommendations that I believe Dave or Antonio mentioned, where they have two categories, and I think even Wisconsin has some of this, that it all boils down to mineralogy. It boils down to how much sand you have in the soil, and the same thing with texture. So these things, I think they do affect K retention, but in terms of whether or not they're mutually exclusive, they all really act completely together. The other thing we've been looking at in the sands is too, and I'll show some of the data, is that we haven't been seeing the response of potassium that I would have expected. We can get some very low soil tests, yet we don't get the response. So the question then in my mind was, particularly with some of the other cations out there, do we see some competition or some effects that these cations might have in terms of that stuff? If you look at some of the data, we have what's called the litotrophic series, which essentially boils down to the relative attraction or the retention of specific cations, some being retained more than others. So calcium and magnesium, for example, will tend to displace potassium more readily on the CEC. So I'll talk about this because I think it does have some impact, particularly when we start talking about some of our sandy irrigated soils. So we have been looking at this ratio of illite to smectite. These are just showing some of the points we have. Again, there's about 30 more points we have to add to this particular data set. Leanna did a lot of the same thing that Dave was talking about in terms of the cluster analysis within the state. And the breakpoint we're finding actually is closer to 2.8. And kind of what I'm thinking about here too is I think that breakpoint is more or less arbitrary. So really what that breakpoint defines is essentially two different types or different soils that we have across the state. So it's not anything I think that we need to be overly concerned about, particularly on the grower side, when it comes down to knowing that within a particular field, what is that actual concentration, because it breaks out pretty closely based on where you're at. And I'll show you some of that because that's one of the key things that when we start looking at these recommendations is that just based on where you're at in the state, I think I can pretty much pin down in terms of what that critical level might be, which really boils down to what the soils are at on those given areas. So we have looked at some of the same things that Dave was showing. The only thing I don't have here is I'm not showing the K-bearing feldspars, but if you look at the K-bearing feldspars, those concentrations tend to follow pretty closely to where we have illite in the state. And if you look at these three maps, the yellow the coloration is more of a, having a problem here. There we go. So it follows closely where those green areas are. So if you look at it kind of central sands down into the southeast, we see relatively higher illite percentages, more smectite if we get to the central and southwest up into the Red River Valley. And then the K-Berry feldspars again follows that relative map of illite. And we start looking at some of the data we have in there, and I start looking at my overall response as some of that relative illite percentage starts to kind of factor into sites where we don't necessarily see as high of a response, or at least as high of a critical level requirement for potassium in some of these given soils. So I'm going to show you where those breakpoints are at, but it pretty much follows, if you look at this map of that green area on that illite side, where we kind of break out that 2.8 to 1, right along this ridge, and the sandier and the silt loam soils tend to break out separately from the loam and clay loam soils across the state. We are looking at the actual critical levels right now. In terms of the high illite soils, we tend to break somewhere around 90 part per million. This is shows milligrams per kilogram. That's the same as part per million. Versus our higher smectite soils, which are closer to 190. The question I have right now, though, is whether or not there's any clustering within those higher illite soils. So looking at sands, this actually includes sands and silt loams, whether or not they behave somewhat differently, because there's times when we start looking at essentially our critical levels pushing closer to 160 part per million for some of those silt loam soils. So this isn't a perfect scenario. We likely could use more data with this, but I think looking at it in terms of the clustering side, we at least have some data to kind of show that we may see some differences across the state for what that target point should be in that build point. And again, I think it boils down to a lot in these soils is that whether or not you can actually get to 200 part per million, which is a lot easier to do in situations where your soils will retain more potassium, or you have a higher CEC and a higher concentration of smectite. So again, this is kind of the first cut of this. We are looking at both the moist and the dried as well. And looking at the data, I see a lot of the same things that Antonio does, but I don't have that clean where you start looking at that improvement if we look at these high smectite soils with using the moist test versus the dried test. So looking at it, there's still some things to work on, but it isn't as clear cut of a decision. That's been the thing I've struggled with, because we've been running the moist test since about 2010. And every soil sample that I have going through my lab right now, if it does get run for K, we do have moist and dried run on that just to look at comparisons of the particular two, just to see if we can do some of the same things that Antonio was seeing. But if you look at the Iowa data versus our data, I think really what it boils down to is the fact that we've just got a higher percentage of soils that have those higher illite contents, particularly more soils that have sands, more irrigated soils in our areas with those silt loams too. While it does stretch into Iowa, into the northeastern part of the state, we just looking at the number of counties we have in some of those karst regions, just the acreage is a lot higher. So what does it mean for your soils? Well, looking for the high smectites, I think we'll stick with the higher critical level. And that's kind of what I'm looking at right now with moving forward. If we look at most of central, southwestern, west central, northwestern Minnesota, I mean, looking at the 200 part per million critical level, I think holds out pretty close. I still do have some questions in the northwest, particularly for some of the Beech Ridge areas. And we're looking at that right now just to see what that makeup is. If you go farther, as you start going farther east out of the valley, whether or not we need to be looking at something similar to what we'd have, maybe recommendations for the southeastern part of the state. But the problem with those sands is it's such a difference in the makeup what's underneath those sands and the amount of clays. It's just such more of a mixed and what I'd call an interesting area in terms of the variability that's out there. And so looking right now, I don't know if we can make just a one-size-fits-all recommendation for that area, but at least the high smectites in the majority of our corn growing areas and the soybean growing areas seem to be holding true. The illites, I mean, it's a sufficiency approach on these, and I'll talk about this because, again, this boils back to K retention and what we can effectively build to, because I think that's really the question here. These soils with the feldspars, I think, will supply some potassium. We see that coming to play, but overall, we just know some of these soils we can't build to the same point as we can in some of these higher smectites. And leaching of potassium is a thing. And I'll show some of this, what we've been seeing on sands in particular, that throwing more at it, just essentially we see more downward movement of potassium in these soils. So do you need to measure it? No. I mean, really, again, what Dave was saying about $300 to $400 per sample, there's really no reason for a grower to do it because there shouldn't be as much small scale variability going on within a particular growing region. So I think if we looked at zip code or some other factor that might be something common that's coming into a soil testing lab, we probably could use that to at least narrow down in terms of what the recommendation strategies would be. And these questions from growers, if they need to measure it, I mean, there's really no reason to send that off and do it, because essentially a lot of the modeling we're using different parent material and other factors to make those maps up. So hopefully, I mean, looking at it, we should see a very homogeneous area. The question is, we do get some sands along some of the rivers, what to do there. And that's one of the things I don't know. I mean, that's some follow-up work that could use to be done, maybe to look at whether or not the sands in some of those areas are similar or they're different from some of the other high clay soils. So again, a lot of my argument in terms of the critical level boils down to the ability of soils to hold potassium. So we are looking at that, and that's one of the things that Leanna's project was starting to look at, is getting into some of the nuts and bolts and what we're seeing in some of our sandy soils, where we weren't seeing responses to the levels that we would expected for the current recommended rates for potassium application. So I kind of went down the road just to see what was going on here, whether or not it was just the fact that the CECs of these were so low that we couldn't retain it. Was there something else? Because a few things I've noticed over the years as I started to look at sands is that the irrigated soils tend to react a lot differently from the non-irrigated soils. It's a lot easier to get potassium deficiencies on a non-irrigated sand, which may simply just be because of the moisture, because again, there's a lot of interactions occurring within these particular soils. So one of the things we were looking at with some of Leanna's work was looking at retention and just looking at some comparisons, because I wanted to know essentially what kind of absorption we'd get if we put, what we're doing with this is putting different solutions of potassium in with the soil, seeing how much potassium then is absorbed by the soil at these different solutions. The interesting thing here with these sandy soils, though, if you look at Becker and the ones up at Cambridge, is the fact that, I mean, they really can't absorb anything. I mean, if you look at our initial rates here, what we applied on here, positive here is really absorbed, so it's potassium that's been taken out of solution. We also looked at this in the presence of calcium, and one thing we saw is you start adding calcium to the solution, we're actually kicking more potassium off these sands. So that made me start thinking a little bit about, why, potentially these dynamics could be somewhat different in these irrigated sites, particularly if you've got irrigation water with high levels of calcium and magnesium, which are in all hard water, if that could be affecting the dynamics. But looking at it in terms of that, we know that potassium really, again, can't be absorbed, and we're kicking more off. We have more of an effect with calcium on these sandier soils versus the clay soils, which if you look at it, we get much more absorption without calcium in the mix, but overall, we see a much greater potential for these soils to latch on and hold on to potassium. The question I have right now, though, is where do we draw the line? So we did have a study, the site we selected out in Big Stone County, which is a sandy clay loam, more clay content, and we were actually seeing more absorption with that. So it's one of the things is, I don't know are all sands the same, or how do we treat them completely differently? But we do know essentially that the target point of 200 part per million is going to be unreasonable in some of these, particularly these Hubbards, which dominates a lot of our irrigated soils, because it just doesn't have the ability to hold on to potassium over time. So, really the questions on this is, does it make sense to build these if they can't retain them? The calcium thing is kind of interesting too, because we talk a little bit about this K base saturation, but if calcium is having an impact with liming or some of these other, it may just be hard to build to that certain point. And we have kind of looked at that, and it really doesn't seem to make any difference. So really the key point on a lot of this, and it's what Antonio would say as well, is the soil test really is kind of the key critical factor. The base saturation really doesn't have a whole lot of impact in terms of predictability. If we look at just a dividing point or a critical level of where a response would occur. So some of the sand sites too, I mean, looking at overall return on investment, we are looking at this. This is kind of interesting. This is a study that Jeff Vetch had. This is funded by Minnesota Corn and AFRIC joint funding. The interesting thing here, though, is just the fact of what we could do with the low rate of K. So looking at this, this is 0, 60, and 120 pounds of annual K application, that over 4 years of the study, that 60-pound application was enough, even though our recommendations would have, if we look at it, 60 pounds, 240 pounds versus what we would have recommended over that years was 510 pounds with the current recommendations. So this is kind of, again, what spurred me on looking at this, is that we need to look at these recommendations, and we need to look more closely at some of these soil specific factors to see if there's some thing at work here, because this is a situation where it just really wasn't worth throwing a lot of money at potash, because the soils were going to hold it over time. And looking at net return, 60 pounds, you can see a little bit different drop in net return. That was just the difference in fertilizer. Again, no difference in yield. So you're looking at a very high net return. If we look at sandy soils versus these higher smectite soils versus the site near Rochester, which would be a silt loam soil, which we're still seeing some positive return, but the overall wasn't as much as we would have expected. So this is kind of, again, I think looking at the argument by where we look at different recommendation in terms of critical levels, is just looking at the fact that our soils don't necessarily behave the same. Does it move? Looking at some data, this is Becker, Hubbard's, you look at, this is potassium with depth where we applied 100, 200, and 300 units K2O. You can see essentially with those higher rates, all we did was enrich the deeper depths of potassium. This is looking at the 12 to 24 inch depth compared to these other locations where we're seeing some increase in soil test K with the high rates at the 6 to 12 inch depth, but really not much overall movement of potassium itself. So again, throwing more K at some of these, maybe not necessarily as efficient. We're just essentially seeing some that move deeper into the profile. So just because it's high at one point doesn't mean that there's crops that won't require it. That's one of the main cautions. I see a lot of information out there, particularly looking at situations where you see a lot of talk of really against applications of potassium, but we know there are instances out there. With critical levels right now, this is kind of what my look, and if you look at what we're thinking for some of these the recommendations moving forward. So we look at a lot of our outwash soils, 100 to 120. And if you look at a lot of our data, I mean, unless you get more clay in that, I mean, really that's about kind of the only that we look at a maximum build point for these. And I do have some semblance of a guideline for that in the current recommendations, but we're still looking at that because really what I want to know, this is 100 versus 160 in the Southeast, since these all group or cluster together with some of that clay mineralogy, can we justify having two sets of recommendations based on that? The majority of the state, I mean, 200, if you look at it, if you're above 200, generally we know that the probability of a response will decrease significantly. If you're below that, that's kind of where we're still looking at trying to improve things and see if we can get to some of the circumstance like Antonio was showing with using some of the different soil test methods to try to get more predictive of the response in those areas. Irrigated sands, I mean, again, this is one of the things with well water. We looked at about 40 part per million of, if you look at the combination of calcium and magnesium, it may have even been a little bit more than that. So that's a significant amount of calcium and magnesium being added. So it's one of the things looking at building it, it just may not be possible if you're adding that on a yearly basis. Whatever you add, if it is retained, it's going to be likely kicked off as you start irrigating. So looking at that, that's why I just think putting just more of a sufficiency approach on those and trying to get just exactly what you need really is a better option for that. And again, really, it's kind of the question, irrigated sands, it may behave non-irrigated. The exception might be potato. I don't work with potato. That's kind of Carl Rosen's area, but we know that that's a crop that tends to respond to higher levels of K. So for corn and soybean right now, that's one of the things I think looking at it is one of the, just looking at the data really doesn't show that throwing a lot of extra potassium at those, even at the recommended rates, really pays, just based on what we've seen for some data on some of those Hubbards and some of those similar high sand soils. So data does indicate differences. I'd foresee 3. I mean, 2 is probably likely right now, but 3. I mean, the separation point, again, just really boils down to if you look at these pink areas. And that's kind of what we're looking at essentially. If we do separate out the state, it's going to be more or less the karst areas and the sandier areas relative to the high clay areas. And again, that 2.8, while it does split at that point, I just don't think necessarily that it's an exact level we need to focus on, that it's more or less the parent materials and the capacity for these soils to retain K. So some of our findings now, clay mineralogy, again, things break at 2.8, but again, that's really not my critical, where I would say that we absolutely have to do that. The CEC, it just follows with mineralogy and also with texture. And then the cation issue we'll continue to look at, but that's kind of an interesting thing looking at just some of that cation selectivity, because again, it just complicates an already complicated issue moving forward. So the moist K analysis will work, I think, if you have similar clay composition. So again, looking at most of the Des Moines lobe is stretching up in the west central Minnesota, I think we could make an argument to utilize it. I've been trying to look at just what options we have, but again, my data, if you look at it, it's still ugly. If we look at it, we still have some of the same cloud of points with the moist analysis. So I'm kind of trying to figure out what's going on with that moving forward, and just seeing if, essentially what that extent at which that might be a benefit for our soils. The speciation works. Again, I think it's a broader issue related to retention though. So if you're looking at soils that just can't retain potassium, that's really I think the key there is looking at putting on higher rates with the mobility that it can have. It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So that's really, we're looking at maybe targeting a lower point with that, just to make sure that at least we're getting the most out of the potassium we're applying. Base saturation right now, we're not looking at that. One of the interesting things though that Leanna found with that is if you looked at some of our soils, particularly in those, some of them that should have responded, that didn't, there was some instances where if you looked at the base saturation, the ones that didn't respond tended to have a higher base saturation. But if we look at essentially where things broke out, soil test was always the most important factor. So it might explain some of why we don't see a response at certain soil tests, but it wasn't the driving factor. Soil test alone was the one. And I think that just really, again, boils down to this broader issue of the supply pool, which is really complicated within our state. So right now, when will you see any changes? I don't know if we'll get to anything maybe till the end of the year. And that's one of the things that we need right now, some more time. So we're still finishing up the particular project with that. And we've got some other work going forward with funding through the Minnesota Corn Growers, looking at some of this non-exchangeable pools as well. So I'm just trying to essentially get a handle on what kind of variability we have across the state, because again, looking at the state of Minnesota, much more variable than what I'd see particularly for Iowa. And that's one of the things that, trying to manage this and trying to figure out the recommendations becomes much more complicated. So it's simply complex. It's one of those things we're working on. But again, it's kind of been interesting going through some of this moving forwards with that. So hopefully you'll start seeing some changes moving forward with some of the recommendations. So that's what I've got. Tim, do we got any questions? So growers applied hundreds of pounds of K2O per acre for multiple years and hasn't raised the soil test levels. Is K becoming trapped within the clay layers? Actually, this is a good question, because it's one of the things I was hoping Antonio would show, because he has some data. There are some soils out there that just won't build. And it seems to be a lot of those soils that are the higher in smectites based on the data I'm seeing. So that could be kind of what's coming into play, essentially, is that you're not picking it up in the soil test itself. And we've seen instances of that. If you look at those non-exchangeable soil tests, where sometimes when you look at different rates of K applied, where you won't see an increase in your extractable, your ammonium acetate test, but you do see the increase in some of that non-exchangeable K. So it's likely going in there. The question though is, whether or not, generally, whether or not the plant's seeing it, which we have a lot of evidence, which it is coming out. So that's one of the things that it's probably what's happening. It's being going at least inside some of those, if it's a high smectite soil, and it's, again, these poorly drained soils seem to be one that seems to be more consistently we're seeing that, where you may apply K but not necessarily see an increase in soil test post applications. Okay, on sands, does it make sense to adopt a split application strategy for K? I've looked at this, and looking at the, if we look at the overall, the efficiency of potassium with a split versus a pre-plant, it's been exactly the same. So we've gone in and actually applied potash at about V5 growth stage. And if you look at essentially tissue concentration yield, it's all the same versus a single pre-plant. So I don't think it really makes a lot of sense just for the split application. I mean, it would, if you look at it from the standpoint of leaching, but it didn't really make any difference for some of the studies. So I don't know if I'd really recommend it for just a standard practice for split applications. Jeff?
Along those lines, Dan, would you recommend pre-plant application for, say, coarse section soil versus fall?
So Jeff asked spring pre-plant application versus fall. I mean, looking at the data we have, if it does move, it moves relatively fast. So essentially, since the soil doesn't have a whole lot of capacity to retain it, you get a 2-inch rainfall event, it's going to move, I mean, maybe not as quick as nitrate, but it's going to go relatively quick. So I think that's one of the ones, Jeff, we focused on spring application specifically for your project, but I haven't looked at it. And it actually might be an interesting thing to look at. So we're doing a timing study now just to see how much we're retaining with that, because fall, spring on the heavier soils, I don't see a whole lot of difference in the soil test, but on the sands, it would makes some sense that it might move down to maybe that 6 to 12 or 12 to 24 inch depth if you get enough rainfall to move it. Okay, any thoughts on Ka use with cover crops? The thing about cover crops is you have to be careful is the majority of potassium in most of your plants is going to be tied up in your biomass. So with cover crops, depending on how much biomass you put on, you could see some increases in uptake from what you apply, but generally if that cover crop, it breaks down relatively quickly, it should release it back. So that's kind of been the big question with retention is while we know a lot of it goes into the plant biomass, it's the speed at which it returns back to the crop that you're trying to get it to. So as long as it gets back quick enough, it should be fine. But if you're using it again, you're likely going to see particularly forage crop, a luxury uptake of potassium. So it's going to take it up no matter whether it needs it. So if soil tests are at 200 part per million and the plant is still showing deficiency, what are your recommendations? Depends on the plant. And we've seen this particularly with soybeans the last few years. If you get, and Antonio brought this up, if you get issues with insects, root damage, you can see deficiencies that will show up. We do tend to see this in the last couple of years in dry conditions where we saw in soybeans some potassium deficiencies on the upper canopy. And I'm not necessarily sure there's anything you really can do about that because that's just more of a induced by what's going on with stresses at the time. With critical levels, I mean, you look at 200 to 220. I mean, if you're kind of looking at those ranges where Iowa's at now, I mean, if you're in that, I mean, generally you should be more often than not at a point at which you're at maximum yield potential. And some of these other things may be something that are just out of our control with issues related to the climatic conditions. How many max pounds of K would you apply in low CEC soil in the spring applied on top of no-till? That's a good question. I've looked at some of the same things that Dave have been looking at, just looking at limits, whether or not we can over apply it. I haven't seen as big of an impact on corn in Minnesota. On soybean, we have seen some issues with higher application rates, more than 100 pounds of actual potash. In terms of the rate, I don't think it really matters as much if you're applying it on top of the surface. If you're talking about retention wise, because it's going to take some time to get down to the roots itself. So I don't have a really good answer for this one. It's a very good question, but it depends if you're looking at a max rate in terms of issues showing up, or you're looking at it in terms of overall availability. I mean, we've been able to apply it to the surface and get it down to the roots in sandier soils with some of the side dress applications. So I don't guess really worried too much about the overall rate. And soil samples testing for K on a seasonal basis, we are looking at that now. I'll probably have some of that towards the winter because we're looking at, as we know that there is some seasonality to the tests. So if you look at over time, you tend to see fluctuations where it's kind of a wave pattern where the K test will increase or decrease. The main thing I recommend to most growers for testing, if they are looking at trying to be consistent, is trying to take the samples at the same time of year, particularly if you're looking at trying to look at trends over time. It's more important to have at least the samples taken at the same time to give you the most comparable results. Is excess chloride the main concern with higher rates? Looking at soybean side, it is. I've done some testing with calcium chloride and potassium chloride, and if you look at applying the same rates, we have the same effect. So you look at it, I mean, chloride, it's more of an impact. I mean, soybean is more sensitive to excess of it. Looking at it, it's looking at with potassium and soybean, I generally don't recommend more than about 100 units, again, applied right ahead of the beans. If you're going to apply a higher rate for a build, it really makes sense to put it on in front of a crop that has less of an issue with chloride. So corn, wheat, some of those, if you're trying to build, makes more sense in those applications and trying to keep it down. And we've seen actually some good results with just 100 units of potash on soybean on that. So it's not, I think, that you need anymore, but I'd kind of keep it to that point just to reduce the risk of over application and chloride issues. I had a lot of questions. Is there any more out here?
One more came up. Would you recommend applying potassium to soybean on a high K testing soil?
So the question is, would I recommend applying potassium to soybean on a high testing soil? I mean, really looking at it in terms of the data we have, there's much greater risk with small yield reductions. And it's been interesting because the yield reductions we've been seeing on some of these higher clay soils have only been about a bushel, which if you're dealing with 65, 70 bushel crop, if you're getting 64 or 69 bushels, would you really notice that? But still looking at it, I mean, there's some risk there. So really where I look at it is even though soybean removes more potassium, it still seems to make more sense to try to apply it ahead of corn because we see much more consistent yield responses on the corn year than we do the soybean year. So I just kind of recommend if you're going to target it, it just makes more sense to target it ahead of a crop that's going to be more tolerant to if you've got, it's going to be more or less prone to some issues with chloride toxicity, which corn seems to be one.
Give Dan a